First, I want to thank everyone for taking the time for engaging in these professional development sessions. We're very excited that we're able to do this for you. You're very important parts of our team, and this is a new way of us to kind of connect and hopefully provide some information about things that will pertain to you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about, it's a tough way to end the day, I got to be honest with you, but we're going to try to understand special education regulations and IEPs, okay? And a lot of you, I don't know the exact collection of everyone in the room, but a lot of you, I'm sure, are special education aides that are here to serve special education students. And how exactly that happens is kind of good to understand, okay? So special education in the United States really started in about 1973, okay? Because there's something called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act that started in 1973 into 75. It is called the Education for Handicapped Children until 1990. And what that is, up until about 1973, 74, 75, it was almost very unusual to see students with disabilities in school. What does that mean? Where were they? A lot of different places. They were in warehouses. They weren't allowed to go to public school. They were too disabled to be with the general population, almost not worth the resources in order to educate them. I know it's hard to believe, but that's where this all came from. So if we were in 1970 and we were talking about special education, it wasn't even really a word. It wasn't even anything that really existed. So you're talking, 50 years ago. Things have come so far, and I mean, I've been doing this since 1997, and it's come really far. And when I see things like this, it almost boggles my mind that this is the way the world was, but this is the reality. And it's important to understand kind of how far we have come. So when they did the federal law, which became the Individual with Disabilities Act, they really looked at giving parents and students rights. And that's something that really did not exist up until this time. So they looked at, when you look at special education in schools, who does it cover? It covers students ages 3 to 21. That's still the same thing today. So we have children in the school district that are 3 years old, they get services. We have children in the school district that are 21 years old, they get services. If they're younger than 3, they get what's called early intervention, and that goes through Nassau or Suffolk County, but they still do get special education. We are now responsible at age 3. Free and appropriate public education for students with disabilities at no cost to parents. That's another big piece. If you had a student with a disability and you were a parent, it was very helpful to be wealthy, because then you could pay for something, okay? If you did not have a lot of money, it was very difficult to get your child into some kind of school that he or she could be educated in. Again, looking at this in 2022, it's hard to believe, but this was the culture before this law was passed. Parents' voice in students' education. Again, parents had little or no rights until the mid-70s. It really was just totally decided by the school district, by the government agencies, wherever this child was, what services they were going to get. And the parents' voice has gotten stronger and stronger, rightfully so, ever since this first started. Teacher participation, once again, we didn't even have teachers involved in making decisions for kids back in the 70s. Impossible to believe. A lot of you guys, I'm sure, are in classes with teachers, see what they do with children. How could they not have a say about what happens in a student's educational career? But that was the way it was. Least restrictive environment, that's a term that you would hear over and over and over again, and you can talk about least restrictive environment for hours and hours and hours, okay? We'll get into it a little bit during the presentation. That just means students should be with non-disabled peers as much as possible, okay? And that's a big topic in the school district and always has been. We're not supposed to be sending kids, an hour and a half away, 2 hours away, unless that's the only place that a child can really get educated, and they should be with their peers as much as possible. Appropriate evaluations. We didn't even know how students got evaluated. Weird doctors would diagnose children. Sometimes they're on the level, sometimes they weren't. Sometimes they had a license, sometimes they didn't. This law changed all that and allowed the appropriate evaluations of students, which to this day we all take very seriously. Any student that you work with that has an IEP, we're going to talk about that, has been evaluated by us. Procedural safeguards, again, that's a protection to parents, and we'll talk about that as we go. Every parent, when they first come into special education, get a book. It's 47 pages long, and it says, this is your rights. And we take that all very, very seriously. And this is all because at one time there was a lot of discrimination going on against students and adults with disabilities. So in New York State, every state looks at special education differently. It's defined federally, and then it's broken into each state. We are New York, obviously. We go by something that's called Part 200. It's Commissioner's Regulations. It's a very long book, which is sitting right there. It's about 280 pages. And it basically says everything that we're required to do. And it's very, very legal. And again, it all is because of those 5 or 6 tenets that I had up there about how we have to protect the kids and the parents. So what is special education? And this is what we're going to start to really talk about as we talk about the IEP. Special education always is what's called specially designed, individualized, or group instruction, or special services or programs to meet the unique needs of students with disabilities. Each student is provided with an individualized education program. What's the key word here? What do you see over and over again? That's what special education is all about. Everything we do is individualized. Every child gets an individualized plan and says what exactly their needs are and what we do for them. And that's why, again, as aides or monitors, there's monitors here too, very important to the success of our kids. So when we look at the special education process, I'll just jump over here. We look at kind of how it all starts. And where it really starts is what's called a referral. And a referral, and there's a slide in a minute, can come from a lot of different people. After we get a referral, we do the evaluation, which we talked about. We determine eligibility if a child is or is not eligible for special education. We develop an IEP. That's the document we talked about. We determine placement. If they're at Howard, is everybody here from Howard? Most people from Howard? Special, there's classes in Gen Ed, there's classes outside of Gen Ed, there's resource room. Those are all different placements we have. Then we develop the instruction, and then we do annual review. Once a year, we update the child's plan with the parent and the team and make recommendations for the next school year. So, least restricted environment we talked about a little bit before, but their needs, and this is, again, is determined at least annually. Placement should be as close as possible to a student's home. Back 40 years ago, maybe a child would be going to school in Elmont and that was the only option they had. Not acceptable, okay? Our children go to Farmingdale. If they don't go to Farmingdale, it's because that's the school that meets their needs, but that's very rare. A student can't be removed from education in age-appropriate Gen Ed classes solely because of needed modifications in the Gen Ed curriculum. So in other words, if a child is in a Gen Ed class, their needs must much be greater than just the curriculum has to be changed for them not to be in it, okay? That's all part of least restrictive environment, being in Gen Ed classes. Supplementary aids and services, and as we start to go through this more and more, I'm going to eventually pull up an IEP and kind of show you where this all is. But this is something that we support our kids, and you guys are part of supplementary aids and services, spelled differently, but still kind of the same thing. You're providing support to the children. Supports are provided in Gen Ed classes to enable children with disabilities to be educated with non-disabled children to the maximum extent possible. So this is the referral process. Who can make a referral? How does a child get to special education? A parent. We get a lot of parent referrals. Instructional support teams, those are building teams. Howard has an instructional support team. Every school in the district has one. A staff member of the school district, a teacher, can make a recommendation. A physician, we get sometimes referrals from outside physicians. In some cases, a judicial officer, and if a student is 18 or over, they can refer themselves. That's how children get to special education. So this IEP, this thing we create, what is it? Created by the Committee on Special Education. So a lot of times you might be in a classroom, you have a teacher, they're going for these weird meetings to talk about kids. That's usually what it is, the Committee on Special Education. That's what we determine what a child gets. And we have meetings constantly here in the school district. Who's on that committee? Number one person, always the parent. Has to be there or the meeting doesn't happen. Not less than one special ed teacher or related service provider. A related service provider could be speech, OT, PT, things like that. Chairperson, obviously, that would be me, or Dr. Baltar. Not less than a gen ed teacher of the student. There always has to be a gen ed teacher on the committee. It's very important. School psychologist, we have 3 of them here in Howard. They're mandated to be on the committee. A school physician, if requested, which doesn't happen a lot, but every once in a while, and a parent member. Now what a parent member is a parent of a disability, of another child with a disability that's been approved by the board to attend these meetings. Up until about 10 years ago, this was mandatory, that we had to get a parent member at meetings. That changed, and now they made it optional. Some parents will request for a parent member, and we will have a parent there. But it doesn't happen a lot. There's the testing. So when we go through an evaluation, this is what we do. We do, wow, sorry, I went all the way to the beginning on that. That was impressive. There we go. We do psychological testing. We do an educational eval to see how a child does in reading, math, and writing. Speech and language evaluation if we are concerned there are speech issues. An occupational therapy, a physical therapy eval. Functional behavior assessment is a specialized instruction eval done by a psychologist if we're concerned about the child's behavior in the school and in the classroom. That comes from this, classroom observation. Teacher reports, teacher input, and obviously parent input. Specialized evaluations, sometimes we recommend psychiatrics, neuropsychs, assistive technology evals based on the needs of the kid. So to be a student with a disability, you have to have a classification. It differs by every state, but in New York State, it has to be one of these 13 disabilities. And I think there's classes that we're teaching about some of these. I think Dr. Baltar just did one on learning disabilities. That's one of 13. Speech and language impaired is a classification. Autism, obviously, is a one that a lot of people might know. Deafness, deaf-blindness, other health impaired. Other health impaired are usually students that have attention deficit, okay, most of the time. Visual impaired, hearing impaired, orthopedic impaired, these are less classifications that we see. Multiple disabilities, emotional disability if a child has significant emotional issues, traumatic brain injury, intellectually disabled. So those are the classifications. Every student has to have one of those 13 classifications in order to get special ed services. When we talk about procedural safeguards and we talk about due process, this is one of the most important things. It's something that's called prior written notice. So when we do a meeting, if I chair a meeting, we make a recommendation. We always have to provide this after the meeting. And what it basically says is, this is what we're proposing. We're making a recommendation and we're proposing this. The parent can say no, okay? And that's something that can be a little confusing sometimes. The parents have a lot of say in special education, which is reflected by this statement that's really true. A parent can decide that they don't want special education for their child and take back the consent they once gave for services at any time. So, I do something there, Jeff? So a parent to get into special education consents for services. If they're not happy with how the program goes, or they're not happy about how something goes, they can say, you know what, I don't want my child to get services anymore. And that might sound terrible to us, because there's certain children that really need the services, and it's hard to imagine them not getting it. But that is it, thanks Jeff, that is a parental right to do so. And it's something to always remember, how many rights parents have. So the procedural safeguards notice, once again, back to parental rights, is a 46-page document which I referred to, that we are constantly giving to parents of students with disabilities. Okay, we use a lot of paper in my office. There's no way around it. So when do we put this copy together? The first time you go into special education, you have to get a copy. Anytime you want a copy, you have to get a copy. If you decide to file for something that's called due process, which is a legal thing, when you disagree with the district, you get a copy. And when a decision is made to suspend or remove a child for discipline reasons, that might be a change of placement, you get a copy then as well. All recommendations must be approved by the Board of Education. Okay, so if I have a meeting, we recommend Johnny to be a student with a learning disability and be placed in an 811 class, Jessica Lee's class. That recommendation still goes to the board. And there's a thing in the regs where the board could disagree with us. Doesn't happen a lot, hardly ever happens. But it's important to remember that every recommendation that we make goes to the Board of Ed, and I'm always doing a board report to report everything to them every month. And again, key word, the IEP addresses the unique words, the unique needs of a student with a disability, okay? This is something that's very important for everybody in this room. Starting in 2002, there was a law passed in New York State called Chapter 408. Okay, and what Chapter 408 is, it requires each teacher or service provider be provided with a hard or electronic copy of their students' IEPs. That means every special education teacher, every art teacher, every phys ed teacher has to have a copy of the IEP. Now, these days we do it electronically. But every teacher signs off that they've seen the IEP. That's required by the law. This is where the aides come into play. Teacher aides must be informed of their responsibilities on the IEPs. And that's something we can talk about when we get to the IEP. The aides don't get a copy, but you need to know what your responsibility is. So if you're working with a child who has a one-to-one aide and has a behavior plan, somebody from the school, a teacher, a psychologist, somebody else, needs to sit with you and explain.
Never.
That's a big problem.
We know that.
That's a big problem. And I'm glad you told me that, if that's true, because that's not an acceptable situation. And I think we need to go deeper into that, if that's the case.
I believe that some buildings do get like a couple of pages, the first couple of pages of an IEP, which would be helpful.
But it goes, yeah, I understand.
We're not explained?
No, I understand, Tina. That's not what the law really means is you're supposed to understand what your function is.
Yeah, no.
It's not enough even to get the piece of paper. Somebody is supposed to sit with you. I mean, you're not required to get a copy, but someone is supposed to explain what your function is. Okay.
Also, if you're put with a student, let's say my student is out for a week, and they put with the new student for a week, you're literally handed a schedule, and told, have a good day.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you're telling me this, because this is the kind of feedback that I really need to know, because that is not the way. So I'm telling you right now, that's not the way it's supposed to be.
It's a change.
Also, I have 3 kids with 3 different schedules. How are you supposed to follow all of them and be on top of them?
I understand.
All different classes.
Yeah, I understand. Again, I don't know the specifics, but I definitely have to find out why a lot of hands went up when I said you're supposed to know what the responsibility. That's never been the word that I don't like. It's never been explained to you, because that's not good.
No, it's been going on for years. You should be in shock. It's been going on for years. It shouldn't be in shock. You're the head of this.
Come into our world. The people that have children, a steady student, are handed their IEP in the beginning of the year. We are handed the paper. Most of us, I can
Not the
speak to
entire
myself.
I I don't think that's done that way at the elementary
It's
schools.
not, that's, the other issue is that we're, some of them here, we get a portion of the IEP, so we know services and
Yeah.
stuff like that, but the other buildings aren't. That just came up at our union meeting, that it's not across the
But
board,
nobody ever
we're
sits
not
with
getting
us.
the same information.
Okay. I'm glad I'm gonna make notes after this, and I will talk to folks and find out why that is, because that is not.
Okay. Let's move on.
Okay, but that's a good, thank you for telling me that. I do need to know. And again, I'll be honest with you, my direct stuff is usually more at the elementary schools than the middle school and high school. That's why we have the chairs, but I do need to know that. Thank you. And by the way, I had a feeling you were gonna bring this up. I would have been shocked if you didn't say something. When I wrote it, I had a feeling, but I'm glad you did. Because it's really something that just, we have to talk about. All right, sample IEP. Hopefully this works. There we go. There it is, wow. So sample is the name of the student. So this is what I really want to kind of talk about the rest of the time, and I want to take some questions as we go. Has anyone never seen an IEP before? Has anyone never looked at all? So you've seen it to some degree? Okay. So an IEP, again, what does it do and what is it supposed to do? It's an individualized document, okay? So when you get into the IEP, this is something that's called the comments. This is a direct recommendations that come from the CSE meeting that we held, okay? Now, we're very careful what we write in these comments, because this is one of the only things that the Board of Education sees. When they run a board report, it will pull this information. We cannot say who the child is, because the board's not supposed to know who the child is. They're supposed to vote based on the needs and based on their decisions, but not based on any individual child by name. It's confidential. So we'll write, based on the latest evaluations, students recommended to continue to be classified as other health impaired, that's the classification we talked about, and placed in the 1211 special class, and receive integrated co-teaching, CSE recommended related services, speech, OT. That's how all the services happen, and it gets reflected here originally. We write the document. This is how the evaluations are done that makes us do the recommendation. So whatever we get, psych input, parent input, report card, speech and language input, etc. These are the scores that kind of base the committee on some of our decisions. This is by far, in my opinion, the most important part of the IEP. There's an academic, a social, a physical, and a management section of each IEP. What the committee does is we talk about the child's strengths, the child's weaknesses in every area. You see math, you see speech and language, you see study skills, what their strengths are, and then what the needs are. And what's one of the most important things? What are the needs that the parent has? So every IEP must say what the parental concerns are. It's very important. We take these recommendations that formulates the needs, and that's how we develop the program, and that's how we develop the goals for the child. It's all based on the needs. If a child doesn't have any needs, doesn't have an IEP. This is social, okay? Sample is easily distracted in the classroom. He can display difficulties interacting with peers. His behavior does sometimes impede instruction. He's been diagnosed with his neurologist with ADHD and takes medicine. Sample must continue to build his verbal social skills. He needs to continue to improve social skills, his ability to handle frustration. Counseling is recommended. Parent informed the CSE. The parent trainer has helped a great deal. Physical development. What kind of deficits does he have in this area or she? So it's got some fine manual control and sensory issues. Occupational therapy is recommended to deal with that. CSEs take a while, and this is why, because this is how this is all done. What does a child need to be successful in class? Teacher redirection, structured environment, needs to seek help when needed, Student requires a behavioral intervention plan. We'll talk about that in a minute. That's very important. Student benefits from movement breaks. Student has a delay in decoding, reading comprehension, math, language, motor, and social, okay? Remember what I said about the goals? When you go down, all those areas I just added, there needs to be a goal. There's your reading goals, there's your writing goals, there's your math goals, speech and language. All the goals all equal the needs of the child. If they don't, then we did something wrong.
Are we supposed to have all of that information?
Not necessarily, no, because you don't get a copy. But you're supposed to be explained what your role is. So I don't know what your particular role is. If you're a one-to-one aid for a child, a lot of times there's a behavior plan or something that should be directing what you're doing. So your part is coming up right here, probably. So this is, what does a child need? Need for behavior strategies. The student needs strategies including positive behavioral interventions. Does a student need a behavioral intervention plan? Here's the statement. A functional behavior assessment is conducted and a behavior plan is recommended. The staff that work with the student must be familiar. That includes you. Okay, so if you have a child that has a BIP, which is a behavioral intervention plan, and you're not familiar with the plan, that makes no sense to me. So there's a problem, because you have to be. These are other areas that we need to talk about on an IEP. Limited English proficiency, whether or not child's blind or visually impaired, communication needs, need for assistive technology. District-wide assessments. Now, one of the other things that's very interesting that sometimes is a little hard to understand, and I screwed this up too, is when you look at an IEP, a lot of people think an IEP talks about what a child is getting in special education, and it kind of does. But what an IEP is basically a blank document. Okay? Sorry, folks. It's a blank document, and it assumes that every child is in general education 100% of the time. And then you have to build the document to say any areas that they're not. Okay, so the assumption is 100% in general education. That's very important. That's a little tough to understand sometimes, even for people that have been doing this a long time, because we kind of think that special ed is all about giving special ed services, which it is only after we've determined that a child cannot function in a gen ed environment. There's a section in here I can't find that talks about it, but maybe down one more. So the push is always for children to be in least restrictive environments, to be with gen ed children. That's everything that we do and everything that we're supposed to do. Here's the programs on the IEP, special class. In this particular case, this is a child who seems to be in a 12-1-1 class and also gets integrated co-teaching services for a period. That means they're in gen ed for that one period. This is written, I think, for a middle school child. Speech and language, occupational therapy, counseling, parent counseling and training, all services provided by the district to the students. Here's a very important part, and this involves you too. Supplementary aids and program mods for the student, one-to-one aid, okay? If you have a child's a one-to-one aid, it's got to be documented on the IEP. Preferential seating, movement breaks, behavior intervention plan, additional time to complete assignments. Those are all things that have to be documented. This child gets psych consultation. If a child needs 12-month services, I know this, anyone here work at the, Stephanie does, work at the summer program? Tina does. So some students have disabilities to the level where they need a 12-month program. So that's why we have extended school year programs. That's the program at Albany Avenue. Testing accommodations recommended by the committee. Here it is right here. Participation with students without disabilities. Removal from the gen ed environment occurs only when the nature or severity of disability is such that even with the use of aids and services, education can't be achieved. So we have to write here when the child is not in gen ed, not when the child's getting special ed. In the areas of non-participation, a student requires special instruction in an environment with a smaller student-to-teacher ratio. It's not written in here, the child's in gen ed all day. Transportation, we have children with all kinds of different transportation. Small bus and vehicles, this child requires an attendant. This is all stuff that doesn't really concern you guys. So this is the IEP. Again, as an aide, you're not required by law to get a copy of it, but you are required to understand what your responsibilities are. That's very clear. So that's my presentation in probably 30 minutes. So all kinds of times for questions. We had some good ones at the beginning, so I'm ready. What do we want to talk about? It's a lot of information.
What are we gonna do?
Sorry?
You gotta
We're
get
gonna know about the students and,
I'm sorry, I can't hear one.
how are we gonna find out about this? Like, how are we gonna work around
Well,
this?
I would need to know who you are assigned to.
All right, I have 3 children.
Okay. So are you a shared aide? Like, how do you have 3 children?
3 to 1.
3 to 1.
3 to 1 aides.
And they're all in different classes.
Say that again.
Yep, exactly.
They're all different.
No, they're all in
They're
different
in
all the
different
time.
classes. Most of them, yes, they have to.
All day? They're never together?
3 classes, they're together. The rest, they're not.
Okay. I would have to check with that. Okay. So you can't be with all. Yeah, that doesn't sound possible. Okay. That's interesting.
And you for the 3 children. That's why we don't have.
I'm sorry. What?
We don't have enough of us to provide for all the children that need aids.
I understand. Okay. I mean, obviously, if an aide is on the IEP, it's the same thing as a teacher's on the IEP. It's mandatory. This is a mandatory document that is really a quasi-legal, I like to call it. You know, there are court cases fought over these IEPs all the time. So if it's on there, it's the district's responsibility to do it, for sure.
Okay, so with that being said, if I was out yesterday, they had no one to cover my child. They literally had to pull a hiking aid to sit with my child. How is that? It just.
It's not ideal, I'll tell you
It's
that.
not. And that's why I'm here today, because I feel bad for my coworkers.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I mean, it's not fair to the child, it's not fair to my peers, it's just not, it's not right.
I know when COVID hit, there were a lot of issues with filling positions and things like that, but still. I agree. No, I know COVID's over. I'm not saying, you know.
No, it's what they're paying us, that's why no one wants to come to work.
What's that?
It's what they're paying us. That's why no one wants to come to work. It's the amount that they pay us per hour. It's what we get paid for what we do. That's why they can't hold
But
on.
getting back to the IEP.
Yes.
If it states it on the.
Yeah, it's
IEP,
legal. I'm not saying it's not.
Right, so. we
It's a
don't-
legal document.
Right, so,
So if it's not being met, it's a problem.
so who do we go to and say, you know, we have, I'm taking care of 3 students.
Well, me, I mean, Dr. Baltar,
I'm meeting you.
yeah. Because again, I have Dr. Baltar here, but yeah. But yeah, she's in charge of special education.
I understand.
You know, she's in charge of it. So I would need to look more into each thing. What I'm saying is it's mandatory. I'm not saying it's not. It is mandatory. We have to do this. This is not an optional thing.
Okay, so here's my, I'm trying to understand this. My student's IEP says a 1-to-1 aid.
Yes.
Let's just say, hypothetically, her student says 1-to-1 aid. Now she's out. But because we don't have enough people to fulfill her spot for the day, I have my student plus her student. Is that legal?
No.
Okay, that's all I wanted to know.
No.
Is it
No, it's
legal?
not, because you're taking from Peter to pay Paul. Is that the old expression, right? From my age. No, it is not. It's not a good situation. It's supposed to be a different individual if it's a 1-to-1 aid.
And then getting back to the point that nobody ever sits with us in the beginning of the year.
Well, that I don't understand. That has to be looked. That to me is unacceptable. I'll be honest with you.
That's what I wanted to ask. So we're not, we shouldn't be privy to the whole IEP. I totally get that.
But you should be explaining the portions that pertain to what your responsibility is. And again, I don't know the cross section of what everybody, but you know.
There are meetings at some of the elementary schools where in 12s.
Yeah.
And the 6s.
Yes.
And I know we've spoken.
I know, I signed the time sheets.
You signed it, but in the secondary, on the secondary,
I
I
know.
don't think it's across the board, elementary and at secondary level, we're not having it.
I know.
That's what, we're here to talk
It's a
about
problem.
IEPs, that's what we need. We need to have those meetings, and we've spoken.
Yeah.
I know you're willing to sign the time sheet.
Yeah.
All of the meetings, you've said that. So that's what we have to figure out, is how we get those meetings in
But there
place.
should be time, when the school year starts, there's gotta be time. I mean, special ed evolves every day, we know that. So again, I just had a CSE before I came in here that changed something. So that's a given. But before the school year starts, there should be somebody sitting with you and explaining what your responsibility is. So if you're implementing a behavior intervention plan, you need to understand, I don't understand how you would do it if you didn't understand what the responsibility was.
Right, and many of the new younger girls, when they got their IEPs or, their assignments the first day, they don't even know the difference between a 12-1, a 15-1, and an ICT class.
Right,
So that's, you need to know that.
Yes.
You need to know these things for your student,
yes,
the best way to help your student. I think we need to somehow get these meetings in place.
yes.
Where,
I agree.
and then we would, that would be.
I agree with you. Now, again, here's the problem. This is hard. Like, this is not easy. Like, to do special education and do it right is not easy because a school district has a lot of different things and a lot of things going on and pulls people in all kinds of different ways. I understand all that. But special education is the one area that, at the end of the day, this is where the legal stuff is. Okay, this is why attorneys are involved in special education. This is all legal. Why is it legal? Because I just showed you the 50-year history of how much trouble you can get into if you're not following the regulations. Okay, so if that's not happening, I will promise you I'll look into it. Yes.
In terms of the IEP, I've had situations where the teacher would say, oh, you can't see the IEP because it's confidential and only a certain amount of people can see it. But me personally, I would like to, if you don't want to give me a copy, that's fine, but I'd like to read it so I can understand fully like what's involved, what kind of issue does the child, I mean, I don't know if it says the child's autistic or the child has social
It says that.
problems or. what-
Yeah, that's the class. That's when I told you before about the 13 classification. So,
Right, and there are some kids that
I mean, this is other health impaired. This could just as easily say autism.
Right, and I've had a kid that I dealt with in the classrooms, the teacher would rotate all the aides, even though you were one-to-one, she would rotate you with other students within that class. So I wound up with a kid that I'm like, well, what are their issues? And a couple of years went by, and then I found out the kid had seizures. And I'm
Yeah.
like, oh, no wonder for me this kid had a seizure. What if he was like, zoning out? I would have thought he was having a seizure. Thank God he never did, but I never knew this. I'm like, I've been in this class for all these years and I didn't know this. So, like, I just feel like it's not communicated. Like, if they do have a plan, let's say they're having, they lash out, or they, have a problem, they throw their backpack or whatever. Like, what do I do in that case? Like, how do I calm the kid down? Or how do I don't feel like we're trained
I understand.
to understand what to do in
Yeah.
certain situations.
But you should have a deeper understanding. Okay, so again, you don't have to get a copy of it. Pass the mic around?
Sam texted, they can't hear you.
Oh, okay. They just said they want to pass the mic. I'm passing the mic around now.
Just for the questions, because
Okay.
they can't hear at Woodward.
Okay, they can't hear Woodward.
Oh, I just think of everything.
I know. That's what I was told. So where am I passing?
Whoever had the question, from here on out, we want to speak into the microphone so the people who are getting it live streamed can hear what the discussion's about.
I was just talking about, the question was, seeing the IEP and understanding what would be involved with the child. If the child has some medical issue or some, I would like to actually see the
And
actual IEP.
what's your function, and then what would your assignment be with the child? What would be, are you what is your assignment?
I'm a teacher's aide, like I could be a one-on-one or I could be a three-on-one.
So if you're assigned to that child, I would think you should know that, yes.
Yes, absolutely. And I would like to visually see it, and then, because I just feel like we're not capable of looking at a confidential document. But if I'm with this child,
No,
why
you're
should I be-
supposed to be described a part of it that pertains to you.
But
And
sometimes
if
if
you're,
someone's interpreting it, they may leave things out. Like I would want to see it, because
Okay.
they may think it's not important, but maybe I might think
No, I
it's
understand.
important to understand about the whole scope of the child. You know what I mean?
yeah, and
In this particular case, if a child has seizures and you're an aide assigned to them, I would think that's information you should absolutely have. Because it's part of who he is. or she. So I would think that's an important piece.
I'm just saying, like in a class, yeah, in a class that happened where we didn't know.
Yeah. No, I understand. Any other questions? No, we have the mic. I'm supposed to pass it around. Anybody want to be on mic? You're going to be here. All right. You want to be heard at Wood Parkway?
Hi, Don. I have a question. Specials, when they're
Yes.
canceled, should they be made up?
Answer that question again.
When the students have specials,
Well, who gets
speech,
canceled?
if they have to cancel the students'
Speech,
time.
OT, and PT.
That's a great question. Technically, that should be made up, yes.
Yes. Technically, they should. Unless it's, I mean, if a child is absent, then they don't have to be made up. But if it's because we're not there, technically, yes. How that actually happens is another story, because obviously that's very challenging. But yes, technically, yes. It's a great question. Any more great questions? Look, you know, this is a very, I appreciate the questions, I really do. Your job is extremely hard. And don't think, you know, we really appreciate everything that you do. And I can tell you that anything I can do to try to make it better, I promise I will. You know, I understand some of this frustration. I don't understand why information cannot be explained to you. That I'm struggling with understanding that, because that seems pretty basic. So that's something that we can definitely work on. As for like subs for aides and things like that, that's a tricky one. But it's, you know, it's as the aid on the IEPs is important as any other part of it. Mandatory. Anything else?
But you're breaking the law by not following the IEP, so we have to figure that out. We have to figure out how, if I'm absent, my student isn't left by themselves or with.
No, it's a fine.
I know, it's frustrating, it's very
We're in the middle of
frustrating.
a contract, and I can't move.
I understand.
I'm not even talking about money, I'm talking about for the student and for us, it's very frustrating. It's hard for the student to now be juggled amongst
Several people.
several different people a day. It's just not, it's not fair.
Well, that's
They don't like change.
That's a good point. They don't like change. You're right.
Do not like change.
No, you're right. And again, you guys have been working with these students for a long time, so your input is, yeah, right off the bat. You know, they don't like change. And if we're piecemealing things, it's not great. I mean, it's really challenging, but you know, there's got to be a better way. There's got to be a better way. Anything else? Well, thank you. I hope this wasn't too brutal. I really do appreciate, seriously, I do appreciate your time. I know it's a lot. And, you know, Tina and everybody, I speak for Tina because I know Tina well, have just been so supportive in trying to, you know, make this communication between us and the aides more frequent, you know, because she's just such an important cog to everything we do. We do, might not seem like it every day, but trust me, we do really appreciate everything you do. So thank you.